My name is Jaden, and maybe if you just looked from the outside you'd think I was the kind of person who had always lived in luxury. The truth is, I grew up in a massive house perched on a hill in the suburbs of Seattle. A classic-style mansion over 18,000 square feet, complete with a hanging garden and a private pond, worth more than $60 million. But what made that place priceless had nothing to do with numbers. My father, Daniel Brooks, was a master architect who not only designed landmark buildings for major corporations, but also spent 15 years of his life building that house. Every stone, every beam was tied to his dream and dedication. None of us ever called it a mansion. To my dad, it was a home built on values. He used to say, "A real home isn't built with money, but with the character of those who live in it." My mother, Helen, was a finance lecturer at a community college. She didn't wear designer clothes or carry expensive handbags, but just one listen to her lecture and you'd understand why my father loved her so much. She could turn complex concepts about investing, saving, and budgeting into inspiring stories. And she applied those lessons to our family life with unwavering discipline. I still remember when I was 8 and asked my mom for a gaming console because all my friends had one. She just smiled and asked, "Would you like to learn how to buy it yourself with your own money?" So I started doing chores, folding laundry, mowing the lawn, even helping organize my parents' mini library. It took nearly 4 months to save up enough. When I finally brought home the console, my mom said, "You didn't just buy something, you learned the real value of money." Even though my family had enormous wealth, my parents chose to send me to the local public school, where my friends had no idea about the kind of numbers my parents dealt with every day. I took the bus to school, ate sandwiches my mom packed, and never wore flashy jewelry. One time when I was invited to a friend's house, my mom reminded me, "Jaden, don't talk about our home unless someone asks. Let who you are be what people remember, not where you live." I learned to live simply in a world where people assumed I had everything. But the truth was, I was taught that the most valuable asset isn't a big house or a bank balance. It's how I treat others, how I face challenges, and the honesty behind every decision. My dad once took me to the top floor of our house, a study lined with walnut wood and windows overlooking the entire city. He stood there, arms crossed, looked at me and said, "Jaden, one day this house will be yours. But remember, that doesn't mean you belong to wealth. Let your value come from what you do, not what you inherit." I was too young to fully understand his words back then, but looking back, every word feels etched into the bricks of my mind. That house wasn't just a roof over my head. It was a quiet reminder that nothing is stronger than ethics and integrity, especially in a world where greed constantly knocks on the door. I grew up with that mindset, carrying with me a quiet world many never see. But I never forgot what my father taught. Wealth without understanding only leads to loss. And I believed that, until the person I loved most shattered everything I held sacred. I used to think that living humbly in a wealthy family was the best way to avoid judgment, but it turns out, sometimes silence itself invites people to make up stories about you. When I was 12, something happened that completely changed how I saw friendship and financial boundaries. I was in 7th grade at Rockridge Middle School, a modest school full of color and character. I had a close group of 3 friends, Chloe, Natalie, and Madison. Natalie was the most outgoing, always laughing, always talking, and the first to ask, "Jaden, is it true your house has an elevator? A private movie theater too?" I gave a half smile and didn't answer. I didn't want my friends to see me as different. I loved our lunch breaks with cookies in the cafeteria, our silly games on the field, and I truly believed what we had was genuine. Then Chloe's gaming console broke. It was a new console her dad had gifted her for her birthday, and she had proudly brought it to school. During recess, she handed it to me to try. I still remember the cold sensation in my palm when it slipped and hit the cement floor with a sharp crack. The screen went black. Chloe stared at me, not crying, but her lips trembled. I immediately apologized and said I'd find a way to fix or replace it. That evening I told my mom. She looked at me for a long moment, then gently said, "Jaden, you can apologize, you can find a repair shop, but you can't use family money to fix mistakes that weren't made with bad intentions. You'll have to take responsibility through your own effort." It took me 2 weeks of doing odd jobs and saving up before I brought the console to a repair shop near school. But when I returned it to Chloe, she didn't smile. Natalie, standing next to her, chimed in. "For someone rich like him, a few $100 is nothing." "Are you even sure that's your console, Chloe?" I froze, that cold feeling returned. The next day rumors started spreading that I'd broken it on purpose to replace it with a cheaper one. That I stole Chloe's console and swapped it out. Madison didn't say anything, but the way she avoided my eyes said enough. The vice principal heard about it when a group of students submitted a complaint, something I later learned Natalie orchestrated. My dad took time off work to come to school. During the meeting with the principal, he sat silently through all the accusations, then calmly pulled out warranty documents, the repair receipt and a confirmation letter from the repair shop. He simply said, "I taught my son that the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand firm." I was cleared. Natalie and Chloe were reprimanded for spreading false information, but what I'll never forget wasn't their punishment. It was what my father whispered to me as we walked out of the school office. "Jaden, some people will only see your wallet, never your heart. Don't let those people define your worth." After that, I distanced myself from that friend group. I no longer shared much about my personal life. I learned how to politely decline when someone asked me to lend them money for lunch or hinted at me picking up the tab. I wasn't cold, just more careful. One time Natalie bumped into me outside a grocery store and scoffed, "Still shopping at discount stores? I thought you only ate at 5-star restaurants." I just nodded. Because by then I understood one thing clearly. You don't need to explain yourself to people who've already chosen not to believe in you. Years later, I still keep that old gaming console, scratched, worn out, and no longer working, but to me it's a reminder of the value of saying no, of the first wounds trust can leave, and of how I learned that sometimes true wealth is the ability to stand alone without losing yourself. I met Jack when I was 35 at a finance seminar in Denver, where I was invited as a guest speaker on digital banking security. He was one of the attendees, sitting in the third row, and the only one bold enough to ask a challenging question after my presentation. Is there a line between the convenience of technology and the cost of personal privacy? That question didn't throw me off, it intrigued me. He wasn't asking to show off, he was asking to understand. After the seminar, we talked for a bit in the coffee area, and I realized Jack was the straightforward, cheerful type with a unique way of thinking. He worked in digital marketing, not wildly successful but clearly passionate. And more importantly, he had no idea who I was beyond that day's talk. Something that felt like a relief. We kept in touch. The first texts were about work, which slowly turned into late-night calls, weekend coffees, then short getaways just to escape the inbox. Jack had a kind of energy that made life feel lighter. He wasn't fazed by my title, never asked about my assets, and wasn't curious about my family. Once I jokingly asked, "Aren't you going to Google me?" Jack just shrugged, "I'd rather learn about you from you." After 2 years of dating, we had a small wedding by Lake Tahoe with just family and a few close friends. My mom sat next to me while I got my makeup done and whispered, "Your dad would be smiling if he saw you today." I believed that too. If he were still alive, I think he would have liked Jack. At least at first. After the wedding, Jack moved in with me into the high-rise apartment my parents had bought for me downtown. A month later, I decided it was time to show Jack more about the home in the western hills of Seattle, the one I grew up in. I hadn't brought anyone there since my dad passed away 3 years earlier. Partly because I wasn't ready, partly because I was afraid someone would see it as a trophy. That visit happened on a sunny Saturday afternoon. When the automatic gate opened, Jack fell silent. He stepped out of the car slowly, like he was walking into another world. The slate roof, the tall windows catching the sunlight through the blazing red maple trees, the pond still shimmering like the summers of my childhood. I watched his eyes as he entered the grand hallway lined with the familiar walnut paneling and the architectural details my father once sketched by hand. "Jaden, you lived here?" His voice was hoarse. I nodded. "I grew up here." He gave a small laugh like he still couldn't believe it. But I noticed something flicker in his eyes. A curiosity I hadn't seen before. After that day, he started asking more questions. At first they seemed casual. How long did your dad take to build this? Who manages the garden? Has the house ever been reappraised? But gradually he mentioned more specific terms. Personal assets, inheritance, deed ownership, and decision rights. I couldn't deny that something inside me began to feel cautious. I didn't want to think poorly of Jack, the man I chose to marry, but I also couldn't forget my father's lessons. The one who truly loves you will respect your boundaries even when you don't explain them. A few weeks later, during dinner at our apartment, as I was pouring wine, Jack suddenly asked, "Jaden, if something ever happened to your mom, who would get ownership of the house in the Western Hills?" I froze, the glass in my hand trembling slightly. Looking him in the eye, I said, "That's a family matter, Jack, and I think you understand that." He smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I was used to. For the first time since we met, I felt a small, thread-thin but razor-sharp distance forming between two people who once promised no secrets, and I began to wonder, was there something inside him I'd overlooked? Just because I'd trusted too soon? The message from my mom came on a Monday morning just as I was about to join a virtual meeting with a bank executive. The message was only a few words. "Jaden, your father needs you." I left the office within 10 minutes. On the way to the hospital, my mind was spinning with speculation. My father had always been healthy. Every morning he walked for an hour around the backyard garden, ate well, and never skipped his routine checkups. But when I walked into the hospital room and saw him lying there with a gaunt face, I knew things were no longer simple. He smiled when he saw me, but the eyes that once held unshakable resolve were now shadowed with exhaustion. I sat beside him, held his hand, and listened as my mother whispered, "The doctor said it's stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Surgery's no longer an option, Jaden." I don't remember exactly how I reacted. All I know is the world seemed to collapse into a single heavy ringing in my ears. I had always believed my father was unbreakable, that he would be there for every milestone in my life, but now I had to prepare to lose him. From that day on, I paused all major work commitments and rearranged my schedule to spend more time at the hospital. I read books to him, shared stories from work, and sometimes played the jazz music he used to love. In those moments, I almost forgot about the reality waiting outside. Jack at first seemed supportive. He occasionally brought snacks, asked how things were going, and picked me up late at night. But just a few weeks in, his patience started to wear thin. One night, when I came home exhausted after a long day at the hospital, Jack was standing at the door, arms crossed, his usual warmth gone. "Jaden, how long are you planning to keep this up?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" I understand you love your parents, but our life also needs attention. You're gone all the time. I feel like I'm alone in this marriage." I stood in silence. I was too drained to argue, but inside something cracked. Was this really the man who once promised to stand by me through everything? A few weeks later, my father passed away on a quiet morning. My mother and I sat by his side, his hand holding mine until the very end. I didn't cry, I just sat there, listening to the monitor go silent, and felt a part of my heart leave with him. The funeral was held in our family's garden, simple and dignified, just as he had wanted. Throughout the ceremony, Jack was there, polite but distant. He avoided my gaze and barely acknowledged the grief I was carrying. After the funeral, my mother handed me a thick file. Inside was a carefully prepared will. My father had left me full ownership of the hillside mansion, the place he once called the heart of the family. The house was valued at nearly $5,500,000, but to me, it was priceless. Jack heard the news from a relative at the funeral, and his attitude shifted instantly. That night over dinner, he suddenly asked, "So, what are you planning to do with that house?" I looked at him, a sense of caution rising in me. "I haven't thought about it yet. Everything's still too fresh." He nodded, then added, "I was just thinking, if both of us were on the title, it might make things easier later. Legally, I mean." I didn't respond, but my heart tightened. For the first time, I felt Jack was looking at my father's legacy not as a family heirloom, but as a prize to be claimed. A few days later, I got a call from the family attorney. Mr. Peterson, my father's longtime friend, he confirmed that all the transfer documents were finalized and I was the sole legal owner of the house. I stood on the second-floor balcony of the mansion that windy afternoon, looking out at the garden my father once tended with his own hands, and I silently promised him I would protect this place no matter what. But I never imagined that the first person I'd have to protect it from would be the man sleeping next to me each night. 6 weeks after my father's passing, the atmosphere in our shared apartment had grown increasingly tense. Jack could no longer hide his restlessness. He started asking non-stop questions about the legalities of the house I had just inherited, and even though I gave clear answers repeatedly, he kept circling back to the same topic. One evening as I was looking through my father's old keepsakes in the study, Jack showed up at the door with a more serious expression than usual. He handed me a stack of papers, placed them on the desk, and said casually, "I just met with a lawyer named Jerry Peterson. He knows a lot about inheritance laws in Washington. I think we should co-own the house to avoid future complications." I stared at him. "Jack, what are you saying? Why would the ownership need to be changed?" He shrugged, trying to seem harmless. "We're married, Jaden. What's yours is mine, right? It's just a formality." I sat up straight, my heartbeat quickening. "No, that house is a personal inheritance directly from my father, and you know that." He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then smiled, but the warmth was gone from his eyes. "Well then, I guess you won't be surprised to hear I already did it." I froze. "You did what?" Jack pulled out his phone, opened an email, and slid it toward me. It was a scanned copy of a property transfer form, stamped, "Pending Review." My name, Jaden Brooks, had been crossed out in red ink, replaced with Jack E. Nolan. I was stunned. "What the hell did you do?" "Jerry said I could process the paperwork as a spouse if I could prove vested interest. And guess what? I already paid him $300,000 up front." I shot to my feet, my voice trembling. "You tried to transfer a property in my name without my consent? Are you insane?" "I did what had to be done. If you won't share, I have to protect myself. We can live like roommates if that's more comfortable for you. Otherwise, I think divorce is a reasonable option." Every word hit like a cold blade. The man I once thought would hold my hand through life now stood before me like a stranger, calculating and cold. I took a step back, struggling to stay calm. "Jack, what you've done isn't just illegal, it's betrayal. You took advantage of me, and the trust I gave you." He crossed his arms, smirking. "Trust? What trust? You hid your family's entire wealth from me. I married someone who never shared anything truly important." I stood frozen, my heart pounding. But instead of arguing, I walked out of the room. I needed proof. I needed to know if what he said was just a bluff. And when I called my father's lawyer, the real Mr. Peterson, not this so-called Jerry, I learned things were worse than I thought. Mr. Peterson sighed after hearing my story. "Jaden, there's no licensed attorney named Jerry Peterson in this state. You've been scammed, and if Jack paid that person, he may have fallen victim to a legal fraud." It felt like the air was sucked out of my lungs. Jack hadn't just tried to steal my inheritance. He'd also been gullible enough to lose a fortune in the process. But the deepest hurt didn't come from the financial loss. It came from realizing I had loved and trusted someone completely unworthy. That night I came home to find Jack sitting at the dining table, his face pale. "Jerry's not answering his phone. I think I've been scammed." I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I simply placed the original property documents that Mr. Peterson had just sent on the table, along with a copy confirming I was the sole legal owner of the house. "You've crossed a line, Jack, and I have no reason to stay with you anymore." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. "There's no explanation that can fix the trust you destroyed." I walked out of the room, quietly. But inside, a door had closed for good. And I knew, from that moment on, Jack was no longer part of my journey. 3 days after that final confrontation, I officially moved out of the apartment Jack and I had once shared. I took nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a wooden box holding the letters my father had written. Everything else, the memories, the dreams, and the promises, I left behind like someone letting go of a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. I moved back to the hillside mansion, once the home of my childhood, now the only peaceful place I had left. I thought that after I exposed the truth and cut ties, Jack would quietly disappear from my life, but I had underestimated the greed and delusion still lingering inside him. That morning, while I was walking with my mother in the backyard garden, the gate buzzer rang non-stop. On the security screen, I saw Jack standing outside, hands on his hips, his face flushed. Either from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. I picked up my phone and connected to the intercom system. "Jack, what are you doing here?" He looked straight into the camera, his voice loud and firm. "Jaden, I have a right to enter this house. You're holding it unlawfully. We need to talk." I responded calmly. "I'm the legal owner. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." As if he had anticipated my reaction, Jack pulled a stack of papers from his coat pocket. I had a new lawyer go over everything. You think you're smart, but I'm not naive anymore. I didn't say another word. I immediately called the security team. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 security officers arrived and asked Jack to leave the premises. He resisted, yelling that he was the victim, that he'd been tricked, that I had no heart. But I didn't go outside. I just stood behind the glass door watching him scream at the sky, while the men who once worked for my father stayed silent and did their jobs. That afternoon I met with my lawyer at the office to finalize something important, a restraining order. I no longer wanted to live with the fear that Jack might show up at my door, switching between begging and threatening. Just as we were about to finish, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. Jack was scammed out of $360,000. Jerry is a fake name, not licensed in any state. The message came from an old acquaintance in the legal field who had once worked with Jack on a marketing project. He knew Jack was spiraling, having lost his money, his reputation, and his marriage. It turned out that the lawyer Jerry Jack had blindly trusted was actually a professional con artist. He had been investigated multiple times for impersonating legal professionals and scamming the gullible. Jack had wired him a massive amount, $360,000, to speed up the transfer of ownership, only to receive a series of forged documents, so well crafted they nearly fooled me too. I should have felt vindicated, but in truth I just felt empty. Jack had thrown himself into the abyss and no one could pull him out but himself. That evening I sat alone in my father's old library, the soft light glowing across the polished wooden desk. I opened a drawer and took out the letter my father had written to me before he passed, a familiar, steady handwriting that calmed me just by looking at it. My dear Jaden, if one day you find your trust betrayed, remember, trust is the most precious thing we build. It takes time to create but can vanish with a single lie. Don't mourn what was lost, because losing what's unworthy is sometimes the only way to keep yourself. I folded the letter and took a deep breath. I knew I had crossed into a new chapter of life, without Jack, without the dreams others once tried to exploit. And if my father had left me anything more valuable than the hilltop estate, it was the strength I held in that moment. Outside, the breeze whispered through the maple trees. I could hear my mother laughing with the gardener. Life was moving on, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly in control. Not just of the house, but of my heart. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I expected, perhaps because Jack no longer had the strength to fight. He had no lawyer, no money, and most importantly, no trust left from me. We signed the papers at a small office in downtown Seattle, a place where no one knew my name or my past. So different from the sunny, laughter-filled wedding by Lake Tahoe just 2 years before. Jack didn't say much during the signing. He just kept his head down, dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. When the final stamp hit the paperwork, I stood up first. I hope you find your way back to yourself. That was all I could say without letting my heart lose direction again. I returned to the estate and extended its familiar calm by transforming my father's old room into a space for meditation and reading. My mother, after staying with me for some time, began focusing on herself, taking art classes, gardening, walking every morning. The house, once wrapped in grief, was slowly breathing again. Then came the day of my father's first memorial. We kept it simple, just a few close friends, some longtime colleagues and neighbors who had known our family since I was a child. Everything was thoughtfully prepared, from the small altar in the library to the white flowers lining the walkway. The setting was solemn but still warm. As the ceremony began, I noticed a familiar figure outside the iron gate. His eyes met mine through the security camera. I froze for a few seconds. Jack. He looked thinner than the last time I saw him. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly messy, and his eyes sunken. He placed a hand on his chest when he saw me watching, as if silently pleading. I stepped onto the porch but kept my distance. Why are you here, Jack? He swallowed hard. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. To you. And to him. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I need you to know I've lost everything. I looked at him, trying to keep my voice steady. You had the chance to hold on to at least one thing, but you chose to give it all up for greed. I was duped. I was stupid. I get that now. The sound of chanting began inside. The guests had all gathered. I took a deep breath, then spoke firmly. Today is for my father. This isn't your stage for redemption. If you still have any respect for me or for him, please leave. Jack nodded, but didn't move. He took a few steps back, eyes full of one last silent plea. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just don't hate me. I stayed silent, not because I hated him, but because I had nothing left in me to feel. I signaled to the security guards. They understood, stepped out quietly without making a scene. One of them spoke softly to Jack and escorted him away from the gate area. I didn't look back. I returned inside where everyone was waiting, where my father's photo sat on the table, surrounded by white flowers and glowing candles. The ceremony went on. No one mentioned Jack's appearance as if he'd never crossed that gate. But inside me, something closed for good. Not the relationship, just the last fragments of regret. That night I sat alone in the tea room my father had designed just for my mother. Outside a gentle rain had begun to fall. I poured myself a cup of hot Earl Grey and watched the raindrops trail down the window. I thought about Jack, how he had entered, stayed, and then exited my life like a storm. Loud, chaotic, shaking everything I thought was solid. But after all, the rain always stops, and the trees bloom again, the house lights up, my mother smiles every morning. And I can finally sleep in peace. When spring returned and the maple trees around the estate began to bud, I knew it was time to write a new chapter in my life. The sorrow over my father had settled into memory, and the scars from Jack were beginning to heal. One early morning, as my mother and I sat at the wooden table under the grape arbor, sipping coffee and looking out at the backyard, she suddenly said, "Jaden, do you think we could turn this place into something special for others?" I looked at her a bit surprised, then realized what she meant. She wasn't talking about selling or sharing the house. She meant giving it a new purpose. I once heard my father say a beautiful house isn't just for admiring, it's for living, breathing with people. And now, as my life took a new turn, perhaps the estate needed a new purpose too, something beyond its material value or legacy. We started by clearing out the basement, which had previously just been storage. I turned it into a small event hall with classic stone walls, polished hardwood floors, and warm ambient lighting. The backyard was expanded into an outdoor wedding space, with a white wooden arch draped in vines and rows of lavender lining the path. My mother, who loved flower arranging, took on the role of event space designer. She named the project the Brooks Estate, a way to honor my father. We hired a team of young engineers to assess the home's structure, making sure everything met safety standards for hosting guests. A quiet reading room became a tea party area. The vintage ballroom on the second floor got a sound system upgrade for small piano performances. Word spread quickly through word of mouth. The first neighbor held their 30th wedding anniversary celebration there. Then a young couple from Oregon booked the Brooks Estate for an intimate wedding with just 40 guests. The awe in their eyes as they stepped through the gate, the applause beneath the wooden beams, the laughter echoing through the garden, it all made me feel I had done the right thing. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free. No more dry financial reports, no more endless Zoom calls, just bright, grateful faces and the simple joy of a perfect celebration. I also began writing again. Old journal entries, memories of my father, reflections from my failed marriage. Not for publishing, but for healing. Strangely, the mansion, once filled with sorrow, was now a place of restoration. Each morning, my mother and I walked the vast grounds, baskets of fresh flowers in hand. We discussed decor ideas for the coming week, chose background music for upcoming weddings, or sometimes just sat by the koi pond, watching the fish glide beneath the clear water. Our mother-daughter relationship deepened more than ever. We were no longer just family under one roof. We were true partners, companions. One day, while reviewing the event booking log, my mother gently asked, "What do you think your father would say if he saw what we're doing now?" I smiled, my eyes turning toward the sunlight streaming through the window. I believe he'd be proud, because we kept our promise, to keep this house alive in spirit. We didn't expand too quickly. We accepted no more than 3 events a month to ensure quality and attention to detail. Every staff member was someone we knew and trusted, carefully chosen not just for their skills, but for their heart. The estate was no longer a relic of a former life, but a launchpad for a new journey. I used to think loss was an ending, but it turned out to be a transition. one that helped me find a stronger, clearer version of myself. The Brooks estate continued to host weddings, reunions, and even quiet celebrations for those on their own path to healing. And me? I remained behind the scenes, growing steadier and happier with each passing day. At the end of that summer, as the last lavender blooms in the garden began to fade, I received an unexpected email. The sender, Jack. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." It took me almost 10 minutes to open it, not because I was still angry or hurt, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to know anything more about him. But curiosity won. And I read, "Jaden, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I just need to say one thing. Thank you. Thank you for ending everything when you did. It forced me to look at myself and face things I never had the courage to admit. I got a job at a small career counseling center in Spokane. It's not flashy, but it's real. I help people who've been incarcerated or bankrupt find direction again. Maybe because I hit rock bottom too, I have the patience to really listen. I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I hope you know, the things you once believed in me weren't entirely wrong. I just wasn't mature enough to hold on to them. Wishing you all the strength you've always had. Jack." I closed the laptop and sat quietly by the second-floor window, where I could see the entire garden turning to autumn. The maple trees were starting to burn a brilliant red, the sunlight dancing gently across the rippling pond, and the breeze carried a soft scent of herbs through the air. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just felt a lightness inside me, as if the last stone had finally been lifted after a long uphill climb. Knowing Jack was living a more honest life didn't make me want to return to the past, but it helped me believe that sometimes fractures can be the beginning of rebirth, not just for me, but for him too. The last months of the year passed in joyful busyness at the Brooks estate. We hosted our first autumn wedding with a rustic theme: oak wood, golden candles, and hand-tied wildflower bouquets. The bride, a literature teacher from Portland, whispered to me as she was leaving, "You didn't just give us a venue, you gave us a real beginning." I only smiled, but that sentence touched something deep within me. In the evenings I often sat with my mother on the back porch, holding a warm cup of tea, watching the twinkling garden lights my father had once installed by hand. He had designed the lighting to highlight every plant, every path. He didn't need to say anything. I could still feel him there, in the wind rustling the maples, in the soft glow over the pond, and in every decision I made with a sincere heart. The estate, my father's life's work, was no longer just a piece of property. It was proof of the power of family love, of resilience in the face of hardship, and of the belief that every crack can be where the light gets in. I once lost everything in the blink of an eye: love, trust, even the image of myself in the mirror. But I found it all again in a different way, not through someone else's promises but through my own actions, choosing what was worth keeping and letting go of what wasn't. One early winter morning I stood on the second-floor balcony, the cold air brushing my face, looking down at the lawn where a couple was taking wedding photos. The bride in her white dress was laughing brightly, while the groom held her hand tightly, as if afraid the wind would carry her away. I rested my hand on the wooden railing, the fresh paint still faintly fragrant, and I understood. This was the end of an old journey, but also the beginning of hundreds of new ones, all starting from this place. The Brooks estate wasn't just a home preserving my father's legacy. It was a symbol of a woman's choice. A woman who once lost her way but found herself again, strong, independent, and no longer needing anyone else to define her worth. And I knew no matter what turns the future might hold, I would always remember one thing: no one can take anything from you unless you hand over your trust blindly. And sometimes, the only way to protect your most precious inheritance is to learn how to let go at the right time. From my own story, I've realized that loss isn't always the end, it can be the beginning of growth. I once loved, trusted the wrong person, and fell because of things I couldn't control. But it was those very fractures that taught me how to rise and rebuild a life with resilience and intentional choices. Happiness doesn't come from having someone by your side. It comes from knowing your own worth and never letting anyone else define it for you. What do you think about Jaden's journey and the choices she made? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next meaningful and heartfelt stories about life and family.